definition of
But
war.
would it be an act of war if someone did it to us? Nobody dies, few casualties, they're in and out, boom, it's a perfect military operation. Would that be an act of war? Of course it would be an act of war. I'm probably the most anti-war person in the Senate, and I would vote to declare war if someone invaded our country and took our president. So I think we need to at least acknowledge this is a one-way argument. One-way arguments that don't rebound, that you can't apply to yourselves, that cannot be universally applicable are bad arguments.
This may look like a procedural exchange about foreign operations, but it's actually a stress test of constitutional limits. What's really being tested here is whether executive power can redefine war simply by renaming it. This raises broader questions about who decides when force crosses a constitutional line, and whether legality is determined before action or justified after it. In this video, we'll break down how language, precedent, and power intersect to reshape accountability in American foreign policy.
Senator Paul.
Our founders debated extensively over which branch of government should have the power to declare or initiate war. Virtually unanimously, they decided, and what was entered into the Constitution was that the declaration or initiation of war would be the power of Congress. Now, we have many advocates, many of whom are here today, who have been advocates for an expansive notion of presidential power. They often argue that wars are not really wars, that they're kinetic actions or drug busts. I think, though, if you reverse the circumstances, it becomes very difficult for these arguments to hold up. So I would ask you, if a foreign country bombed our air defense missiles, captured and removed our president, and blockaded our country, would that be considered an act of war?
Well, I think your question is about and I will acknowledge you've been very consistent on all these points the entire career. So let me, no matter who's in charge. So I will point to two things. The first is it's hard for us to conceive that an operation that lasted about 4.5 hours and was a law enforcement operation to capture someone we don't recognize as the head of state, indicted in the United States, wanted with a $50 million bounty.
My question would be, if it only took 4 hours to take our president, it's very short, nobody dies on the other side, nobody dies on our side, it's perfect. Would it be an act of war?
We just don't believe that this operation comes anywhere close to the constitutional definition of war.
But would it be an act of war if someone did it to us? Nobody dies, few casualties, they're in and out, boom, it's a perfect military operation. Would that be an act of war? Of course it would be an act of war. I'm probably the most anti-war person in the Senate, and I would vote to declare war if someone invaded our country and took our president. So I think we need to at least acknowledge this is a one-way argument. One-way arguments that don't rebound, that you can't apply to yourselves, that cannot be universally applicable are bad arguments. So my next question would be, let's say it's not a war. And we're just going to define it away and say it's not a war. That's one of the arguments. So it's a drug bust. What if a foreign country indicts our president for violating a foreign law? Should we extradite our president, or should we be okay if they come in and get him by force?
Look, I think ultimately we're always going to act in our national interest. And so if somebody comes after our national interest, like the case you've described, which obviously does not exist at this time, but the case you've described, the U.S. always has the right to act in its national interest and to protect itself. So really I don't know about this equivalency. Well, does this justify them doing it? We're always going to do what's best for the United States and America. We're always going to protect our system.
But the point isn't, and you're exactly right, we will act in our national interest and we should. So I'm not disagreeing with you at all. What I'm saying is, though, that our arguments are empty then. The drug bust isn't really an argument. It's a ruse. The war argument, not a war, is a ruse. It's not a real argument. And we do what we do because we have the force, we have the might, we do it because it's in our interest. So we wouldn't let anybody come in, bomb us, blockade us, and take our president. We've had arguments about legitimate, illegitimate presidents, bad elections, rigged elections. So there's all kinds of same arguments that we've had in our country that they've had in Venezuela. But we wouldn't argue for an indictment. And these things aren't idle speculation. I mean, Netanyahu's been indicted by the ICC. And one of the reasons I object to being part of the ICC, and I would say you and the administration probably agree, is we're not going to let any international council indict our president and arrest him somewhere on foreign soil. We're not going to do that. We actually, most of us probably object to indicting Netanyahu in that way as well. So I think the arguments are invalid. So we did get the legal opinion that Senator Kaine referred to, the OLC opinion, Office of Legal Counsel. And I think a lot of it's been released. Plus, they came to our caucus and talked most of the open about everything they had classified. So I will talk about at least one of the arguments. They say this war wasn't a constitutional war. Therefore, it doesn't rise to the constitutional notion of us declaring or having to initiate the war. It just doesn't rise. And one of their main arguments was not enough people died. And so there is some number that they aren't specific, but there is some number. I would assume, although I'm not positive, but the 50, 60,000 soldiers who died in Vietnam might be enough for them to call that a war. But here's the problem. It isn't the number, it's that it happens in retrospect. See, our founders gave us the power to initiate or declare war. They didn't give us other powers to execute the war. Those are left to the president. But if we have to wait to see how many people are killed, we have to wait, as they describe it, as the scope, nature, and extent. If we have to wait to see the scope, nature, and extent, the war has been going on for some time. It's hard to vote to initiate a war that's been going on. And we can say this war is over, but we're still blockading it, and we may go back in. But there are no clear answers. We put 2,000, we leave 2,000 troops in. Are we going to call that war and initiate it? So the definition of war is very important. And I think we have to acknowledge the problems with our argument. Calling things kinetic action is a disservice to our soldiers. Oh, you weren't really wounded in war. You don't have a Medal of Honor for war. You have a Medal of Honor for a kinetic action. So I think let's call it what it is, and let's vote on these things. But I think we're in violation of both the spirit and the law of the Constitution by bombing a capital, blockading a country, and removing elected officials. And we certainly wouldn't tolerate it, nor would I if someone did it to us.
But we didn't remove an elected official. We removed someone who was not elected, and it was actually an indicted drug trafficker in the United States. And their system...
Our laws, indicted under our laws. Look, Bolsonaro says that Da Silva is not really the president of Brazil. Our president said Biden wasn't really the president. Hillary Clinton said in 2016 Trump wasn't the president. So you have these arguments, and I agree with you. It probably was, and most likely was, most assuredly was a bad election. He wasn't really elected. But at the same time, if that's our predicate, and you don't have to come to us because then it's a drug bust, we're just removing somebody, you can see where it leads to, and it leads to chaos. And that's why we have rules like the Constitution, so we don't get so far out there that presidents can do whatever they want. It is this check and balance. And I would argue for 70 years we've been going the wrong way. It isn't just this president, but it's a debate that I think is worth having.
What just unfolded in that hearing was not a routine exchange. It was a collision between first principles and modern power, between the words written into the Constitution and the reality of how authority is exercised today. In a calm but relentless line of questioning, Senator Rand Paul forced the room to confront an uncomfortable scenario. If another nation did to the United States what America has done abroad, would anyone hesitate to call it an act of war? That single question cut through the legal jargon and political defenses. It stripped away euphemisms and exposed how language is often used, not to clarify, but to conceal. When actions are renamed as operations, when force is reframed as something smaller, cleaner, or temporary, it becomes easier to bypass the hard questions the founders intended Congress to ask. Who decides when force is used? Who authorizes it? And who is accountable when the line is crossed? Senator Paul's argument was not about personalities or party. It was about symmetry, about whether the standards we apply to others can survive when reflected back on ourselves. He painted a hypothetical that felt unsettling precisely because it was so clear. A foreign power enters, disables defenses, removes a national leader, and leaves. Few casualties, short duration, efficient. By any common understanding, that would be an act of war. And yet, when the roles are reversed, the definition suddenly becomes flexible. Secretary Marco Rubio responded with the reasoning that has become familiar in modern Washington. The action was limited. The duration was short. The individual targeted was not recognized as a legitimate head of state. The justification rested on legal interpretations produced behind closed doors, opinions written after the fact, and arguments that hinged not on what was done, but on how severe the outcome appeared to be. And that is where the deeper issue lies. The Constitution does not measure war by the number of lives lost or by how long an operation lasts. It speaks to initiation, to the decision to use force beyond our borders. The founders understood that once that door is opened, consequences follow that cannot be neatly controlled. That is why they placed the power to declare war in the hands of the legislature, not the executive. Not because presidents lack resolve, but because unchecked power, even when used with confidence, tends to expand. What we witnessed in this exchange was a warning about how far that expansion has already gone. Senator Paul argued that redefining force after it happens empties the Constitution of meaning. If Congress must wait to see how events unfold before deciding whether something qualifies as war, then its role becomes ceremonial rather than substantive. The decision is already made, the action already taken. The check comes too late. This debate also revealed something deeper about how moral certainty is constructed in American foreign policy. When officials say, "We acted in our national interest," they are often correct. Nations do act in their own interest. But that explanation, standing alone, is not a moral argument. It is a statement of power. And history shows that power, when separated from restraint, rarely limits itself voluntarily. The exchange touched on legitimacy, on disputed elections, on who gets to decide which leaders are recognized and which are dismissed. Those arguments have echoed across decades and continents, including within our own borders. That is precisely why rules matter, not because they guarantee perfect outcomes, but because they prevent chaos born of convenience. When every action can be justified after the fact, nothing is truly prohibited. What made this moment especially striking was that it came from a senator known for opposing unnecessary conflict. When someone consistently skeptical of force says he would vote to declare war if such actions were taken against the United States, it forces a reevaluation of easy assumptions. This was not a call for aggression, it was a call for honesty. Call actions what they are, debate them openly, vote on them, own them. The response from the administration side relied heavily on legal distinctions and classified briefings, on assurances that internal reviews had taken place. But the public exchange made clear that legality and legitimacy are not always the same. A system can produce a legal opinion for almost anything. What matters is whether those opinions align with the spirit of the Constitution or simply provide cover for decisions already made. This is not just a debate about one incident or one administration. Senator Paul himself acknowledged that this drift has been happening for decades, under presidents of both parties. Each expansion becomes the new baseline. Each exception becomes the next precedent. Over time, the extraordinary becomes routine. And in that normalization lies the real danger, because when power is exercised without clear authorization, it erodes trust at home and credibility abroad. It teaches future leaders that the limits are negotiable, that words can be bent, that oversight is optional, and that the people's representatives will be informed but not truly consulted. What this moment revealed is a system at a crossroads, a choice between reaffirming constitutional balance or continuing down a path where force is defined by convenience and justified by outcomes rather than principle. It exposed the tension between efficiency and accountability, between secrecy and democratic consent. These are not abstract concerns. They shape how America is seen, how decisions are made, and how future conflicts begin. They determine whether the Constitution remains a living restraint on power or becomes a historical reference cited selectively when convenient. The founders did not design the system to be easy. They designed it to be careful, to slow things down, to force debate before action, because they understood that once force is unleashed, even briefly, it changes everything. Moments like this hearing matter because they pull these questions out of classified rooms and place them in public view. They remind us that the Constitution is not self-enforcing. It relies on people willing to defend it, even when doing so is uncomfortable or unpopular. The question now is whether that warning will be heard. If you believe these debates matter, if you believe power should be questioned and authority examined, support our work. Subscribe to Liberty Report USA and help us continue to expose the truth, one hearing at a time.